Okay, if I'm understanding you right, you're saying it's absurd to talk about white school shooters because there are only about three actual school shooters a year killing around 8 people annually, and that DOJ and Brady stats show about 209 people killed in school shootings over 25 years, which you contrast with more black men killed by black men in a week. So, read as generously as possible, that 209 death figure roughly lines up with one very narrow way of counting K through 12 fatalities on school grounds since Columbine. And if we can confine ourselves strictly to that definition, then around 200 deaths isn't pulled from thin air, right? The problem isn't that such a narrow slice of data doesn't exist. It's that you're treating that sliver as if it's the whole picture and then using it to imply that school shootings are statistically trivial, and that my argument about how we racialize violence somehow collapses. That leaves out college and university shootings, leaves out the far larger number of people who are injured but not killed, and leaves out the psychological and social impact on the millions of students who live with lockdown drills, threats, and trauma, even if they've never counted in that fatality total, right? The more black men killed by black men in a week line has its own problems. First, it's not a like for like comparison. You're putting a really narrow category, the K through 12 school shootings over 25 years, up against all homicides of black men in every context in a single week. So any group will look worse, right, if you compare all of their homicides to a tiny cherry pick slice of harm for someone else. Second, the fact that most violence against black people is committed by other black people doesn't tell you anything mystical about black culture. It tells you that crime is overwhelmingly intra-racial for everyone, including white people, because people commit crimes where they live and against the people around them. So when you point at those raw numbers without controlling for concentrated poverty, segregation, neighborhood level exposure to guns, and decades of policy choices, again, you're treating structural conditions like they're a character flaw baked into black communities. If we control for socioeconomic factors across the board, the pattern you're describing would track more tightly with concentrated disadvantage and easy access to firearms than with race itself. So, where this connects directly to my original post is how the same person can read statistics one way for white Americans and a very different way for everyone else. When the offenders are white school shooters, you slice the numbers down as tightly as possible and essentially say, this is such a small group that you can't draw any broader conclusions about white people. But when the conversation turns to black communities or immigrants, suddenly we're talking in huge aggregates, right? More black men killed by black men in a week, with no comparable effort to control for poverty, segregation, neighborhood level access to guns, underfunded schools, or any of the structural conditions we both know shape crime patterns. So if we agree that a few dozen white school shooters over decades are far too few to define white culture, then by the same logic, a few dozen Somali offenders, Mexican offenders, or black offenders can't define those entire cultures either, right? It doesn't make sense to demand precision, context, and strict definitions when the numbers might reflect badly on white Americans, and then drop all that nuance when the numbers can be used to reinforce stereotypes about everyone else. On the whataboutism point, that's also not what my original post was doing. A real whatabout deflects, right? Don't talk about immigrant crime, talk about Chicago instead. What I did was keep the focus on one question, cultural essentialism, and use white school shooters as a controlled comparison to show a double standard in how we interpret group statistics. I wasn't saying forget violence in black and immigrant communities. What about white people? I was saying, look at how we refuse to read white violence as proof that white culture is inherently broken, but we're willing to read violence by Somalis, Mexicans, or black Americans exactly that way. That's not changing the subject. That is the subject. It's an examination of who gets treated as an individual shaped by circumstance and who gets treated as a walking stereotype whose worst members supposedly reveal the truth, right, about their whole culture. So yes, if you narrow everything down to K-12 campuses, exclude colleges, injuries, and non-fatal trauma, and use one specific counting method, then roughly 200 deaths since Columbine is in the ballpark. And I'm not disputing that that number exists. What doesn't follow is the leap you're making from that narrow stat and from an apples to oranges comparison with all homicides of black men to the claim that school shootings are insignificant or that they somehow can't be a part of the conversation about how we talk about white violence versus everyone else's. The whole point of my post was that we should apply the same standards all the way across. If we insist on context and complexity when the perpetrators are white, then we owe that same context and complexity to Somalis, Mexicans, Black Americans, and other marginalized groups, instead of using their worst examples as evidence that those people are just like that.